This episode will consist of topics around domestic abuse, domestic violence and sexual violence. If you require any support or help, please get in contact with your local domestic abuse, sexual violence organisation. In the UK, you can call the National Domestic Helpline on 0808 2000 247. And if you are listening overseas, please contact your national helpline where support, advice and guidance will be available for you. Hello everyone. It's been a minute since the last time that I recorded an episode, especially for those that are listening outside of Spotify. There's a few episodes that you have missed. The reason why they haven't been able to be carried over to the different platforms is because they contain music. I do recommend that you go and listen to some of those. They are survivor stories. They are raw. They are empowering. They are humbling. They are lived experiences that inform the way that us as practitioners support survivors of domestic violence and or sexual violence. So please do go and have a listen to some of those that haven't been able to be carried over onto those different platforms. Welcome to the new followers that we have. You are very welcome here. And this is just a platform where I start to open up a conversation between us, for you to have conversations with other people about what you've heard. So thank you for joining us and following us. Please do continue to listen and share and subscribe and all of that stuff for others to hear us. We're being listened to by many different countries across the globe, and that is amazing that you guys are listening. But on the other hand of that, it just goes to show that it's not just here in the UK where domestic and sexual violence is an epidemic. It tells me that it affects every single part of our globe because of where you're listening from. So thank you for joining us. If you are listening outside of the UK and there is anything that comes up in any of these episodes, it's really, really important that you touch base with your local services. I don't know what your local services are, but you will. So if you do need support, advice, guidance, reach out to your local organisations. So we are going to jump into this week's episode and we're going to talk all things trauma and understanding the importance of being trauma informed. And what that means is being informed of the trauma of why somebody may do what they may do or their experiences, and understanding that the reasons why that may be. I think when we hear the word trauma, most of us would have an instinctive understanding of what that means. It would be fair to say that somebody that has experienced some form of trauma, they have experienced severe distress or harm or suffering that has resulted in overwhelming mental or emotional and physical pain. Trauma is caused by and magnified by discrimination, marginalisation, historical and generational trauma. There is no secret that survivors of domestic violence will need time to feel safe again, and that can take a long time. And that's just not the physical sense of feeling safe, but actually the emotional and the mental feelings of being safe again. And that often is way after that the actual danger of abuse has been eliminated, so that the abuser or the perpetrator is no longer in their lives, but it still takes a long time to feel whole and safe. And I think that meeting the needs of those survivors that have experienced trauma takes a great deal of sensitivity. And I don't think there's anything that's going to come up in this podcast that is going to be news to you. Here in the UK, and I think in the States, this approach has been going for many, many years, and we've adopted it here in the UK about being trauma informed. Well, that's a nice little buzzword, but what does that actually mean? And what's the ethos behind that? But actually, if you really strip it down, it's common sense. That's all it is. It's common sense of going from one position of looking at somebody's behaviours and going, what is wrong with you because of their behaviours that you are not liking? For example, somebody being obtuse or rude or aggressive, or there are issues with substances or alcohol, and focusing on what is wrong with you to a more compassionate stance of what's happened to you. What has happened to you in order for these behaviours to be manifesting? And how has this experience affected you? Rather than focusing on the behaviour. That is not rocket science. It really isn't. But actually, we make it a problem. We try and we're just not being human enough, I don't think. I think we're getting better, but I don't think that we are as compassionate as we should be. I think no matter what type of abuse that someone has lived through, trauma can have a long-term effect on the body. Headaches, joint pain, sleeping difficulties, gastro problems, respiratory problems, cardiovascular issues, so like stress, all of that can be a result of a trauma. So what is traumatic for one person may be very different for another, and the way that trauma has affected somebody can be very different. So it's about allowing somebody to follow their own path to healing, and it becomes from us as professionals telling somebody what is wrong with them to allowing somebody the space to be able to have a perception of what's happened, or allowing somebody to take a moment of going, where am I within my own healing process? Being trauma informed recognises that trauma affects the brain. Anybody that has experienced any form of trauma will have some effect in their brain. That could be hyperactivity in the lower areas of the brain. For example, the amygdala and the hippocampus. When somebody is experiencing trauma, it overrides that prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of our rational choices and modulating our emotional responses, which can keep somebody in survival mode. Survival mode is that fight, flight, freeze mode. Memories can be stored in the wrong place within the brain, and it can make difficult memories very active in somebody's brain. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is a specific set of symptoms that some trauma survivors developed. People with PTSD will relive the trauma event. They could avoid situations that remind them of the past, often having negative thoughts about themselves or the world. Hyper arousal, being anxious and constantly on the lookout for danger, having trouble sleeping, getting very angry or irritable, are all symptoms of somebody that could be experiencing some form of trauma. So being trauma informed takes into account the physical and the mental effects of trauma, but it's looking beyond what's happened to asking different questions and going from where are you now to where do you want to be. It offers survivors a chance to rebuild connections that were fractured, rebuild trust, often in themselves as well, like trusting themselves, believing that they are capable of making choices. Survivors always need space to be able to make decisions in abuse and in abusive relationships. Some of those choices may have been taken away from them. I think it's really important that we understand domestic violence and being trauma informed. There are episodes on this platform really nailing down some of the stuff that I'm talking about. But just to remind ourselves, domestic violence is that pattern of abusive behaviour in relationships that's caused by one person within that relationship to maintain power and control. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological. And again, there's episodes that really break that down for you. But it's any behaviour that intimidates, manipulates, humiliates, isolates, frightens, terrorises, coerces, threatens, hurts, injures, or wounds somebody within that relationship. That ultimately is what domestic violence is. We know that domestic violence is impacted by anyone of any age, of any colour, of any sexual orientation or religion or gender. What may increase or decrease those odds of victimization, for example, is gender. We know that domestic violence is a gendered crime. I'm not saying for 1 second that men cannot be victims of domestic or sexual violence, but women and girls disproportionately are affected by violence. You have those that are in poorer backgrounds at a higher risk of domestic violence. Immigration statuses can be increased, that isolation, somebody's ethnicity and ability or disability, actually, even as well. We know that those victims of domestic or sexual violence in demographics of Black and minoritized groups, they often find it more difficult to talk about their own experiences, as well as males. Males find it very difficult to talk about violence, especially if that violence is coming from a female partner. There are episodes there where we look at the power dynamics and those different tactics that somebody would use. So if you haven't listened, please do go back and listen to some of those. And the reason why I'm kind of just reminding ourselves of that is because somebody may not have experienced a car crash or not experienced somebody dying around them, for example, or being in war or being in earthquakes, all of those obvious things that we would associate with trauma. I think it's important that we just remind ourselves that actually those victims are constantly being traumatized on a daily basis, often by their perpetrator. Being trauma-informed is about engaging people with their own histories of trauma, and that it recognises the presence of those trauma symptoms, like I said, those gastro issues, mental health distress, the drugs, the alcohol, the not sleeping, the anxiety. They're all symptoms of trauma. And as a professional, acknowledge that role that trauma plays in somebody's lives, in some of the choices that somebody is making. And I think as a professional, extremely important that we don't re-traumatise. Oh my God, how many are listening where you are a professional, a social worker, a police officer, a healthcare practitioner, a DA practitioner, a teacher, where we are expecting our victims to tell us over and over and over and over again about their own experiences. Man, oh man, oh man. Like, how are we and why are we just constantly re-traumatizing our survivors? We are getting better at working together with different agencies and having that multi-agency approach, but we still expect our survivors to tell us our stories if we're a new worker, or there is a new social worker or a new DA worker or whoever that is. We've got to repeat our stories again and again and again. So I think that we have to have a basic understanding that somebody that has been affected by trauma may be re-traumatized in their own narrative and their own account to try to explain to us as professionals of where they're at. Trauma is just simply exposure to any traumatic situation or event that overwhelms somebody's ability to cope. In this sphere where we're talking about sexual, physical, emotional abuse or neglect within a relationship, it could be a traumatic grief. It could be somebody that has lost somebody as a result of suicide. It could be somebody that has abandoned us, be that in childhood or be that in adulthood. It could be those natural or man-made disasters. It could be medical trauma. So any of those can cause a traumatic response. What causes that experience to be traumatic is that it has involved a threat to somebody's physical or emotional well-being. It is overwhelming. Those feelings are so strong that we just don't have the words or the ability to compartmentalize, if that's the word, or have those rational thoughts about what we're doing because it's so overwhelming. It results in extreme feelings of fear and a lack of control. So those that are experiencing eating disorders, for example, that is a way of being able to have some form of control around their own lifestyles, in a sense. It can leave people feeling so helpless, and it changes the way that somebody understands themselves. I'm bad, I'm responsible, I did this, all internalizing the way that somebody will view themselves, the world, and other people around them. Somebody that is hypervigilant will be constantly distrustful. They're distrustful of everybody around them because they're waiting for the attack to happen. Domestic violence, and let me make this very, very clear, domestic violence is a trauma experience. It psychologically changes somebody's belief in themselves. It diminishes the ability to trust others and themselves. It hinders their ability to make decisions for themselves, especially where coercive control has been the abuse within that relationship. So there's never ever been any physical violence, but they are that controlled that they don't know how to make a cup of tea, or they don't know what they want to eat, or they don't know what film they like, or they don't know what to wear, or those really simple decisions that we make on a daily basis. Somebody that has experienced coercive control are unable to make because somebody else has made those decisions for them. They will have often a decreased sense of safety. Like I said, they'll be looking around them constantly at the different threats, and that fear, that intense feeling of fear that will flood the brain with hormones that are stress inducing, which results in those behaviours that we as professionals may find quite challenging. Anybody that has experienced any form of trauma, it can overwhelm those coping resources. We as humans don't want to feel pain, so we can numb that pain. We can also get very stuck, so we can be very hypervigilant. The brain is scanning constantly for danger, and it's sensing and it's reacting to perceived threats. So for example, for me, and I don't mind making myself vulnerable, is that when I feel scared, when I am fearful, when I am vulnerable, my fight response comes to the forefront. So I could become quite arsey, or I become quite defensive. I could easily be described as standoffish or hard to reach, maybe a fair way of describing myself. but only in certain situations that I feel scared. I would like to think that I'm not like that all the time, but there you go. It is that natural response that's going on in my brain that actually it's perceiving some form of threat. So my fight, freeze mode is coming in, and mine happens to be fight. So actually somebody on the other end of that, knowing that may be an issue, is going to be really helpful to me. So again, another example is that I recently had to have an operation. I've never had an operation in my life. I've never had to have anaesthetic. I've never been put to sleep. This was causing me lots of issues within my own mind. But actually being able to tell the practitioner, hey, I've never had an operation. I'm feeling really quite scared. I'm really, really, really quite vulnerable. And being able to say that to the practitioner then enabled the practitioner to maybe potentially have a different response to me, because they understood that actually I was feeling a little bit nervous. They were able to really put me at ease because they understood that I was nervous. We can't just assume that somebody understands that we're scared or that we're frightened, or just assume somebody assuming our own lifestyle stories, because they don't. They often don't know that you may be experiencing or have experienced any form of trauma. I think within those little examples, hopefully you'll kind of get the sense of actually me, understand that my trigger is fight, but I also understand, because of my own journey and my own healing and all of that stuff, that I'm able to really say to somebody, hey, I'm feeling really quite scared right now, and for that person to come in with a different approach. That is being trauma reformed. So understanding, and that we may have to modify and be a little bit different when we are seeing those manifestations of a trauma response. PTSD will have those behavioural manifestations that we may not understand. Again, I think we need to be very, very clear that those trauma responses that somebody is experiencing is completely normal for a human who has spent their life in survival or adapting to a very traumatic life. So those feelings are very, very normal in a very abnormal situation. But I think we also have to acknowledge that although those feelings may be completely normal, they may also interfere with the survivor's ability to enact different patterns and behaviours. For example, maintaining abstinence or maintaining appointments or housing, for example. So those behaviours, the responses, the feelings are very normal for those that have experienced trauma, but they can also interfere with the way that survivors have those patterns of behaviours. If you're a professional, what does that trauma look like? How does that show up? Well, it can have difficulty with regulating emotion, quick to anger, quick to tears, feelings totally disproportionate to the situation that is going on. For example, hyperarousal, those flashbacks, nightmares, those startled reactions that somebody may have, memory and concentration problems, pain, sleep disturbances, illnesses, weaker immune systems, substance abuse issues that we often see a lot, short attention spans, very easily distracted, maybe could be ADHD or ASD, but it also could be a symptom of trauma. Those that have been diagnosed with EUPD, which is the emotional unstable personality disorder, or dissociative disorders, or personality disorders. I am not a mental health expert, so do not quote me, but I would, in my experience, would be saying that there is a baseline of trauma somewhere within the brain. much slower thinking, difficulty with making decisions, those intrusive thoughts, loss of sense in time and space, trouble with concepts and complex directions, all can be a way that trauma can manifest itself in somebody's life. Working with survivors of trauma will take time. I think it's really important that we use language that empowers and that is compassionate. So, for example, something that I may say to a survivor is, today I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about your life. There's no wrong or right answers. This is about you and what you have experienced. You can answer yes or no, or you can prefer not to answer the question if you don't want. The information that we're talking about here isn't going to impact the way that I will support you or how other agencies will support you within that. Within that example, it's about actually allowing somebody to take control. This is what we're going to do today. This is where we're going to go. It's up to you about how far you want to go within that process. There's no right or wrong. So validating people's experiences. We have to promote safety. So we have to ask those questions regarding domestic violence sensitively. We have to ask about safety in the home, safety from others, safety to themselves. It could be that they are having a crisis which is affecting their mental health. So being able to have those conversations are going to be really important. We have to value those survivors' lived experiences. We have to value that. We have to acknowledge people's relationships between the survivor and the different service providers that are often in somebody's lives. What's their family and friend support network like now that they are not in that abusive relationship? Are there fractured relationships? We have to take in the historical and the social forces that can often traumatize survivors. Some tips for those survivors, those that are experiencing, that are on their journey of healing, I would say empower yourself. Look for choices that you can make towards your greater wellness. What makes you happy? Going for what? Yoga, whatever it may be. Look for choices that are going to bring you positive stuff rather than negative stuff. The drugs and alcohol, it may numb stuff for a short term for the whilst that you're using, but the very next day you're gonna feel shame and all sorts of things and pain, and so you block it out again. So, and all of those stress hormones that are going on in the brain, we need to counteract that with the happiness chemicals, oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, things that are going to give us greater mental wellness. Validate your experiences. You matter. Your life matters. Your experience matters. You are more than what has happened to you. You are not where you are yesterday. And where you are tomorrow will be further than where you are now. So appreciate who you are, appreciate your journey and what you've survived, because you have survived and you are here. You don't have to share with everybody. And actually, I think for professionals that are listening to this, I think we need to take heed of that as well. Just because we are a professional doesn't mean that actually we have the right to know somebody's life and their deepest, darkest fears or feelings. Yes, we may be able to, point in somebody's direction, but that doesn't mean that we have a God-given right that a survivor has to tell us their story, because they don't. So you trust who you need to trust, and you can share with what you like, as little or as much as you want. I think appreciating how far you've come, that is no mean feat. You are worth it. You're worth the effort. Forgive yourself. And that is sometimes harder than it sounds. But forgiving yourself, those regions of the brain that was controlling those emotions, those instinctively responses of the fight, or flight might be overactive. But forgive yourself. Non-verbal techniques can be just as effective to calm the deeper regions of your brain. So those deep breathing techniques for a minute, meditating for a minute, can be a safe way to not overwhelm the brain with all of those emotions that are going on. Writing is a really good way of connecting with your emotions. Music also, yoga, breathing, I've already said, and exercise. All of that stuff produces the counter action of those stress responses. For those of us that are supporting, be that because we got friends or family or we are professionals, let's just take a reminder. Everybody will heal differently. Everybody will have their different ways of their coping styles. They may not be the way that we would cope with stuff, but that's not down to us to judge and or speed somebody along in their healing journey. We do have to be kind. We do have to be patient. We do allow the survivor to have the space to say what they want to say. So not forcing a survivor to talk about their experiences. If they don't want to talk about their trauma that day, then fine. It can be just as healthy to those that do or don't. Trauma lays dormant, and it can take years to speak about their trauma. And there could be a number of reasons why people don't talk about their trauma. It could be fear of being labelled a victim, or their past experiences of being victim blamed. It could be that they've just got on with life and then something has happened where it's ignited that trauma. So it could take years. Somebody could be, plodding along and you think that somebody is doing well, and then something kind of comes up. Life throws a curveball and we get tripped up, and actually all of those trauma behaviours are all starting to manifest. Healing takes time. We can't just say to somebody, let it go and move on. It doesn't work like that. Trauma does not work like that. Understanding that the relationship that you have with the survivor is absolutely as valuable to them as their healing. The relationship that you may have may have been very challenging, and it could have moments where it's been really, really great. And then there's moments where it's not been so great. But it's normal for the relationship with survivors to adjust as the healing takes place, and that they feel more empowered and rebuilding trust. As a professional, the greatest thing is for somebody to be able to move from a place of not making choices to making choices, regardless if they are choices that I would or I would not make in my own life. And, involving a survivor within that journey is going to be paramount. Asking open-ended questions, not being accusatory, not blaming, not kind of focusing on all of the bad, but focusing on some of the good, focusing on the things that have got them to this point so far. Being non-judgmental, absolutely key. Pointing out the person's strengths. What have they done well? Let's not focus on the negative. Don't minimize somebody's own experiences as well. So minimizing somebody's and invalidating somebody's response is not going to be good. Allowing space for silence. God, how many of us don't like silence? Allowing that space for silence allows somebody to process. Allow somebody to come to their own thinking about how they feel within that moment. It is important to understand trauma in being able to support those that have experienced any form of violence. And you've just listened to this week's episode. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation this week. Feel free to like, share, subscribe so you don't miss out. And I'll see you next time.